అయితే మా ఏఎన్ ఛానల్ ద్వారా ఉమ్మడి మహబూబ్నగర్ జిల్లానే కాకుండా గద్వాల, వనపర్తి, నాగర్ కర్నూల్, నానపేట్, నాగర్ కర్నూలే కాకుండా నిజామాబాద్ జిల్లాలో మా ఏఎన్ న్యూస్ ఛానల్ తరపున మీ డిజిటల్ ఆన్లైన్ క్లాసెస్ ద్వారా మీ విద్యార్థులకు బోధించవచ్చు.
हम आपके शहर निजामाबाद, महबूबनगर, गद्वाल, नारायणपेट, वनपर्ती और नागर कर्नूल में भी दस्तयाब हैं.
आप जानते हैं कि देश में कोविड-19 कहां से आया है. आप ये भी जानते हैं हमारे देश में सैनिकों को किसने मारा. यकीनन उस देश को, इस देश से उनकी हर वो चीज को और वो ऐप को इस देश से उखाड़ कर फेंकना है. आप और हम मिलकर कदम उठाएंगे.
అయితే ఇంకెందుకు ఆలస్యం, మీ ఆన్లైన్ డిజిటల్ క్లాసెస్ కోసం సంప్రదించవలసిన మా చిరునామా ఏఎన్ఏ న్యూస్ ఛానల్, ఓల్డ్ ఆర్టీఓ ఆఫీస్, మహబూబ్నగర్ జిల్లా. మీరు సంప్రదించవలసిన మా ఫోన్ నెంబర్లు 9502612340.
Online classes is just a call away.
విద్యార్థుల భవిష్యత్తుకు బాటలు వేస్తూ మునుపెన్నడూ ఎరుగని అత్యుత్తమమైన ఫలితాలతో అద్భుతమైన విద్యా ప్రమాణాలతో ముందుకు దూసుకుపోతోంది శ్రద్ధ జూనియర్ కళాశాల. మహబూబ్నగర్ జిల్లా కేంద్రంలో ప్రముఖులు, అనుభవజ్ఞులైన చైర్మన్ జగపతిరావు ఆధ్వర్యంలో 2011లో స్థాపించబడిన మా శ్రద్ధ జూనియర్ కళాశాల ఉన్నతమైన విద్యా ప్రమాణాలతో ఇంజనీరింగ్, మెడికల్లో చక్కని ర్యాంకుల సాధనలో విజయం వైపుగా కృషి చేస్తోంది. ఇంజనీరింగ్ అయినా, మెడికల్ అయినా శ్రద్ధ జూనియర్ కళాశాల విద్యార్థులదే పై చేయి. ఇంటర్ తో పాటు ఐఐటి, నీట్, ఎంసెట్ నందు లాంగ్ టర్మ్ ప్రోగ్రామ్స్ ద్వారా కార్పొరేట్ కళాశాలలో 20 సంవత్సరాల అనుభవం కలిగిన అధ్యాపక బృందంచే ప్రత్యేక శిక్షణ తరగతులు నిర్వహిస్తూ డైలీ ప్రాక్టీస్ పేపర్స్, వీక్లీ టెస్ట్, కౌన్సిలింగ్ ద్వారా విద్యార్థుల నైపుణ్యం మెరుగుపరచడం మా ప్రత్యేకత. హ్యాండ్బాల్, ఫుట్బాల్, క్రికెట్ లో మా విద్యార్థులు జాతీయ క్రీడాకారులుగా గుర్తింపు పొందుతున్నారు. జిల్లా కేంద్రంలో సొంత భవనాలలో కళాశాలలు, విద్యార్థులకు ఉదయం, సాయంత్రం వేళలో స్టడీ అవర్స్, ఐఐటి, నీట్ లో ప్రముఖుల నిపుణులచే విద్యా బోధన, బాలికల కోసం ప్రత్యేక క్యాంపస్, ఎంపీసీ, బైపీసీ గ్రూపులతో కో ఎడ్యుకేషన్, ఎంపీసీ, బైపీసీ, ఎంఈసీ, సిఈసీ గ్రూపులతో గర్ల్స్ క్యాంపస్, ఎంపీసీ, బైపీసీ గ్రూపులతో పాటు ఐఐటి, నీట్, ఎంసెట్లతో అకాడమీ.
I am Mariam Makbul. I passed out from Shraddha Junior College in 2017 from BPC. Currently, I have passed out from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I finished my bachelor's. So one thing which is very striking about this institute is the immense and genuine amount of effort that the team of faculty puts and takes up for the success of students and their prosperity. And another thing that is very remarkable about this place is they ignited in me the spirit of competitiveness, which is very necessary in this globally evolving market world. There was one Sanskrit slok which which I learnt when I was very young. Udyame nahi siddhyanti karyani na manorataihi nahi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe mruga. This means you cannot just achieve anything just by thinking of it. You need to put in effort. That is what I have learnt from this institute. Like, even though lion is king of jungle, it has to hunt for its own prey, which is what I have learnt from Shraddha Junior College.
I am Uday Kiran. I have completed my intermediate in Shraddha Junior College in 2019 and I have joined Srinidhi Institute of Science and Technology and I scored my JEE Mains percentile as 98.19 and due to some other problems I didn't join NIT and I have scored my MCET rank as 4500 and here the lecturers take the special care with each and every student.
సీనియర్ మరియు జూనియర్ ఇంటర్ అడ్మిషన్ల కోసం సంప్రదించవలసిన మా చిరునామా శ్రద్ధ జూనియర్ కళాశాల, కో ఎడ్యుకేషన్ క్యాంపస్, మెట్టుగడ్డ. మీరు సంప్రదించవలసిన మా ఫోన్ నెంబర్ 9494430200. ప్రత్యేకమైన గర్ల్స్ క్యాంపస్ కోసం సంప్రదించవలసిన మా చిరునామా ఆపోజిట్ పంచవటి హోటల్, న్యూ టౌన్, మహబూబ్నగర్. మా ఫోన్ నెంబర్ 7337294653. ఐఐటి, నీట్ అకాడమీ కోసం సంప్రదించవలసిన మా చిరునామా శ్రద్ధ జూనియర్ కళాశాల, మెట్టుగడ్డ. మా ఫోన్ నెంబర్ 9491629962.
Welcome to online class Botany second year. So in last class we discussed something about enzymes. How do enzymes bring about such a high rate of chemical conversion? How do enzymes bring about such a high rate of chemical conversion? So how do enzymes bring about such a high rate of chemical conversion? So you know that the enzyme molecules having the substrate binding sites, where the substrates are bind at the active sites, the substrate bind at the active sites of enzyme to become an enzyme substrate complex. Enzyme substrate complex. Soon after completion of the time, the breaking and making of bonds transform the substrate into enzyme product complex. Then the enzyme is release the product without changing enzyme molecule. Between the process, the formation of enzyme substrate complex is called transient phenomenon. Between the formation of enzyme substrate enzyme complex formation, so many intermediate transient state of structures, transition state of structures are formed, which are unstable. The stability of the molecule, the stability of the product related with the energy, which can be explained with simple graphic model. So the y-axis which shows potential energy, the x-axis shows progression of reaction. So here, if we observe that the substrate level, the substrate and potential energy difference, the energy of potential, the P is below the substrate. There is no need of supply of any energy for reaction. So it is a exothermic reaction, energy giving reaction, endothermic reaction, or energy taking reaction, or spontaneous reaction, whatever may be. The substrate, the average substrate energy, the average substrate has to reach some transient state or transient energy. The average difference between the substrate level and transient level, this level is called active energy. When we observe the active energy to transform the substrate into product, so in absence of enzyme, the activation energy, this is activation energy is more. In presence of enzyme, the activation energy is low. That is thus the enzyme reduce the activation energy to convert the substrate to product. That is thus the enzymes are lower the activation energy to transform the substrate into product. So this is how do enzymes bring about such a high rate of chemical conversion? Means because of the enzymes, the chemical reaction require activation energy lower in presence of enzyme. Now we shall discuss about that the nature of enzyme action. It is important for 4 marks. Important for 4. So you know that. Everyone has to know that the enzyme molecule has a substrate binding site. Substrate binding site. So here it is essential the substrate which bind with enzyme at active site to become a enzyme substrate complex. Enzyme substrate complex. So the substrate is very close to active site. So here during the process the enzyme catalyze the reaction and breaking and making of the bonds, the substrate is converted into enzyme product complex. Enzyme product complex. Enzyme substrate complex which is transformed into enzyme product complex. Soon after formation of enzyme product complex, so the enzyme is release the product without changing the enzyme molecule to react with another substrate molecule. The formation of enzyme substrate complex is essential for catalytic activity. The enzyme catalytic activity, the formation of enzyme substrate complex is very essential. The formation of enzyme substrate complex has been explained with lock and key by Emil Fischer. Lock and key hypothesis by him. So how the enzyme substrate complex, why the enzyme substrate complex formation takes place? So it has been explained by the Emil Fischer. So the formation of enzyme substrate complex phenomenon has been explained with what? Lock and key hypothesis by whom? Emil Fischer is the scientist in 1884. The formation of enzyme substrate complex has been explained with lock and key hypothesis. This is the hypothesis, lock and key hypothesis by Emil Fischer. It is important for 2 marks. Who explained about ES complex formation and what are the hypotheses? Lock and key hypothesis by Emil Fischer, and much later in 1973 it has been explained with induced fit theory. Induced fit theory by Daniel E. Koshland. Whom? Daniel Koshland much later explained about the EM complex induced fit theory as induced fit theory. So these two are important for 2 marks. So who explained about that the lock and key and induced fit theory means a lock and key theory Emil Fischer and induced fit theory Daniel E. Koshland. The right lock, the lock open with right key, that is a lock and key hypothesis. The lock open with right key, that is the lock. So when the structure is not amicable to the structure of substrate, the substrate which induce the enzyme molecule to change the structure according to the substrate, that is the induced fit theory. Now we shall discuss the enzymes are catalyze the reaction. So the catalytic cycle can be explained with 4 steps. Catalytic enzyme catalytic cycle. The process of enzyme catalytic cycle can be explained with 4 steps. Enzyme catalytic cycle. Catalytic cycle which can be explained in 4 steps. So if the enzyme catalytic cycle can be explained in 4 steps. In first step, so enzyme catalytic cycle also 4 marks important, 4 mark question. So action of enzyme, 4 mark question. So have to write. So what is enzyme substrate complex? What is enzyme product complex? What is enzyme product? Then who explained about the enzyme substrate complex? You have to write in that. And at the same time, enzyme catalytic cycle steps also you have to explain. You know that very well about that. The substrates are bind at the active site of enzyme molecule. The substrates are bind at the active site of the enzyme molecule to become enzyme substrate complex. This is the first step. The enzyme molecule, the substrates are bind at the active sites of enzyme to become enzyme substrate complex. That is the first step. In second step, the substrate induce the enzyme molecule. The substrate induce the enzyme molecule to change the structure. So the substrate which induce the enzyme molecule alter the structure and bind tightly around the substrate. This is the enzyme molecule. This is the substrate. The substrate is induce the enzyme molecule to bind tightly around substrate molecule. Bind tightly around substrate molecule. Induce the enzyme molecule to bind tightly around the substrate molecule. That is the induce the enzyme molecule to bind the substrate around tightly. That is second step. The third step. So now the substrate is proximal to the active site of enzyme. The substrate very close. Substrate is very proximal to active site of enzyme. Then the enzyme broken the bonds and making the new bonds to become a enzyme substrate, become an enzyme product. So the substrate is very close to the active site, then it break the bonds and making the new bonds, then the substrate is transformed into product. Substrate is transformed into product. That is the third step. Fourth step. Now the enzyme release the product. The enzyme is release the product. The enzyme product complex, the enzyme is release the product without changing. The free enzyme molecule is ready to bind another substrate molecule to continue the cycle. Thus the catalytic cycle takes place by enzyme. So during the catalytic process, this is the enzyme catalytic cycle. So which can be complete in 4 steps. In first step, the product substrate is bind at the active site of enzyme molecule to become an enzyme substrate complex. In second, the substrate is inducing the enzyme molecule change its structure and firmly bind the substrate around. Now the substrate is very close to the active site, it break and making the new bonds. Thus the substrate is transformed into product, enzyme product complex is what. Soon after, the enzyme product complex, from enzyme product complex, enzyme release the product and becomes free enzyme molecule. Now it is ready to bind another substrate molecule to continue the catalytic cycle. Okay. Now, the factors influencing the enzyme activity. The factors affecting the or affect the enzyme activity or catalytic activity. So many factors are. The enzyme activity can be affected by changing the structure of tertiary protein. Changing the structure of tertiary protein. So the factors are affect to change the structure of tertiary proteins. So the enzyme activity affect by changing the tertiary structure of enzyme protein. While the enzyme protein structure is changed by different factors, then the enzyme activity is affected. So the factors include affect the enzyme activity, or the factors includes first one is temperature. Second, pH. Third, concentration of substrate. The enzyme activity can be affected by changing the tertiary structure of protein, enzyme protein. The factors includes temperature, pH, concentration, substrate, and inhibitors. So these are the four factors influence the enzyme catalytic activity. The enzyme catalytic activity affected by some factors. So the factors which change the structure of tertiary protein, so that affect the enzyme activity. So in these, the temperature and pH. The enzyme activity effect. The enzymes are active at narrow range of temperature and pH. The enzymes are active at narrow range of temperature and pH. So the enzymes are active at particular temperature and pH. The enzymes are active. So the factors, you know that, just I now explain. Temperature, pH, concentration of the substrate, and inhibitors are affect the catalytic activity of enzyme. The catalytic activity of enzyme is affected by some factors: temperature, pH, substrate concentration, and inhibitor, a special type of chemicals which bind the active site, inhibit the catalytic activity. That is inhibitors or inhibition process. So let me know that how the temperature and pH. The enzymes are active at narrow range of temperature and pH. Enzymes are active at narrow range of temperature and pH. At narrow range of temperature and pH, the enzymes are active. So the enzymes are highly active at particular temperature and pH. The enzymes are highly active, high rate of active at particular temperature and pH. The temperature, temperature and pH, temperature and pH which activate the enzymes. The enzymes are active at particular pH and temperature. Such rate of temperature and pH is called, such point is called optimum. Such point is called optimum. Optimum temperature and optimum pH. So what is optimum pH? What is optimum temperature? Enzymes are highly active at a particular point of temperature and pH. Such point is called optimum temperature, optimum pH. The temperature, both the temperature and pH are below or above, the enzyme activity is decline. The both below or above the optimum point, the enzyme activities decline. The enzyme activities decline. This is the temperature. This is the pH. So raising the temperature, as the temperature raises up to optimum point, the activity increase, and above or below the activity, below the optimum point, the temperature below or above the point, optimum point, it decline. So in pH also, the below or above the optimum point, the both temperature and pH activate pH, the enzyme activity decline. So the enzyme activity decline, not exceed. So at low temperature, it preserves the enzymes and becomes inactive. At low pH, low temperature, the enzymes are preserved and becomes inactive. At low temperature, the enzymes becomes inactive. At high temperature, the enzymes becomes denatured, which is destroyed, denatured. At low temperature, it becomes inactive. At high temperature, the enzymes become denatured. That is the temperature and pH. So the enzymes are active at a narrow range of temperature and pH. The enzymes are highly active at particular point, particular temperature and pH. Such is called optimum temperature, optimum pH. So both below or above, the enzyme activity decrease. Below or above, the enzyme activity decrease. So at low temperature, the enzymes are preserved and becomes inactive. At high temperature, the enzymes becomes denatured. It loses its activity, catalytic activity. So that is the pH and temperature. Now concentration of the substrate. With increase the concentration of the substrate, the rate of enzyme activity also increase. So the third one we discussed first and second. pH is over. The third one is concentration of the substrate. See this. With increase the concentration of the substrate, it increases the enzyme activity. The enzyme activity also increase. Further, increase of the concentration, there is no increase of enzyme activity. So the increase of the concentration, it shows the increase of the enzyme activity, catalytic activity. Further, the increase of the substrate is not change any enzyme activity. The enzyme activity is not increased because the substrate molecules are more than enzyme, because the enzyme molecules are fewer than substrate molecule. Once the enzyme molecules are saturated, there is no molecules to bind there is no free enzyme molecules to bind the additional substrates. Why it is not increasing means, so one thing you know that, so as the concentration of the substrate increases, the enzyme catalytic activity also increases. Further increase of the substrate concentration, there is no change in the enzyme activity. Why? The enzyme molecules are fewer than substrate molecules. Substrate molecules are more and enzyme molecules are fewer. Thus, once the all enzyme molecules are saturated, there is no enzyme molecules to bind, there is no free enzyme molecules to bind the substrate. Thus, the action of the enzyme is not increase. So the concentration, the substrate concentration required to cause the off maximum value of enzyme velocity. The substrate concentration required to cause the maximum velocity of enzyme is called Mitchell-Menten constant, that is Km value. Km what? So the substrate concentration required to cause the off of maximum velocity of enzyme activity is known as Mitchell-Menten constant. Mitchell-Menten constant. So the Km value is always approximately inverse affinity to the inverse affinity of enzyme molecule to the substrate. Km value is always approximate inverse enzyme affinity to substrate. Inverse enzyme affinity to substrate. Thus, as the substrate molecule, substrate concentration increases, the enzyme activity is not increased. So as the substrate concentration increases to some extent, the enzyme activity is also increased. Further, there is no change in enzyme activity because the enzyme molecules becomes fewer than substrate molecules. After saturation, all the enzyme molecules, there is no free enzyme molecules to bind additional substrate molecules. The concentration which required to cause of the maximum velocity of enzyme activity is known as Mitchell-Menten constant. That is the Km value. Km value is always approximately inverse enzyme affinity to the substrate. That is the concentration of the substrate. Then inhibitors. The active site of enzyme. The enzyme active site bind with the special chemicals. The chemicals, binding of the chemicals shut off the enzyme activity is known as inhibition. The chemical is called inhibitor. So inhibitors. So it is important for 4 marks. Write about the enzyme inhibitors. Write about enzyme inhibitors. First way we have to know what is inhibition or what is inhibitors. So the enzyme active sites bind with special chemicals which shut off the enzyme activity. The phenomenon is called inhibition. The phenomenon is called inhibition. The chemical is called inhibitor. The process is inhibition. The chemical is called inhibitors. The inhibitors are of three types. Inhibitors are of three types. The enzyme inhibitors are of three types. Enzyme inhibitors are of three types. The first one, competitive inhibitors. Competitive inhibitors. Second one, non-competitive inhibitors. Non-competitive inhibitors. Third one, feedback mechanism. These are the three enzyme inhibitors. Let me discuss one by one. Competitive inhibitors. These are the chemicals. These are the chemicals which are structurally similar to the substrate molecules. So the chemicals which are structurally similar to the substrate molecules. So these chemicals are compete with substrate. These are compete with substrate to bind active site of enzyme. So this is the chemical, this is the substrate. Both are compete to bind at the active site of enzyme. Thus, the substrates are not bind at the active site of enzyme. Then it inhibit. Then the chemical is inhibit the enzyme activity. Then the chemical is inhibit the enzyme activity. Such are called competitive inhibitors. Em cheppanu? Competitive inhibitors means what is inhibitor, what is inhibition? Just now I explained you the chemical which bind active site of enzyme and it shut off the enzyme activity. The phenomenon is called inhibition. The chemical is inhibitor. The inhibitors are of three types. Competitive inhibitor. In competitive inhibitor, the chemicals are structurally similar with substrate molecule. Substrate. Thus, the chemicals are compete with the substrate to bind at the active site of enzyme. Thus, the enzyme activity is shut off, inhibit. Such are called competitive inhibitors. Example, succinic dehydrogenase. It is an enzyme. Succinic dehydrogenase, an enzyme. The succinic dehydrogenase enzyme catalytic activity inhibited by the malonate, which is structurally similar to the succinic dehydrogenase enzyme. So malonate, which is structurally similar to succinic dehydrogenase, hence the malonate is compete with the succinic acid to bind at the active site. So the succinic dehydrogenase activity is catalytic activities which is inhibit, that is malonate. So the succinic dehydrogenase activities inhibited by the malonate, which is structurally similar with the succinic acid, succinate, which is structurally similar with the succinate, succinic amla, succinic acid. The malonate is structurally similar to the, so that is the example, that is the succinic acid. Then non-competitive inhibitors. The chemicals are not structurally similar to the substrate. The chemicals are not similar structurally to the, not structurally similar to the substrate. The chemicals are not compete with the enzyme to bind at active sites. These chemicals are not compete to the enzyme to bind at the active site. They bind other than active sites. They bind other than active sites. As the result, it change the globular structure of the globular structure of enzyme. Thus, the enzyme catalytic activity is inhibited. What is non-competitive competition inhibitor? In this, the chemicals are not structurally similar with the substrate. Second, these chemicals are not compete with the substrate to bind at the active site. They bind other than active site. Not bind other than. So as a result, it changes its globular structure. Thus, the enzyme activities decreased or stopped. Example, so some mercuric acid, silver, mercury and silver, mercury and silver. These are the non-competitive inhibitors. Non-competitive, mercury and silver are non-competitive inhibitors. Then feedback. The end product of chain of enzyme catalytic reaction. The end product of enzyme catalytic is inhibit the first reaction of enzyme. So the chain of end product of catalytic reaction of enzyme is inhibit the reaction of first enzyme as homeostatic state of metabolism. So this is the best example in market. When the products are not sell immediately, which is accumulate in the factory, the production will be stopped. That is the feedback. So the chain of end product of the catalytic reaction of enzyme inhibit the first reaction of enzyme as homeostatic metabolism. That is called feedback mechanism. Okay, here we conclude the class. Next we continue the class and close the chapter day after tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
మీ స్కూల్స్ మరియు కాలేజ్ విద్యార్థుల కోసం ఆన్లైన్ డిజిటల్ క్లాसेस ద్వారా బోధించాలనుకుంటున్నారా?
क्या आप आपके कॉलेजेस, स्कूल्स और ट्यूशंस को डिजिटलाइज करना चाह रहे हैं?
మీ విద్యార్థుల కోసం సరైన ప్లాట్‌ఫామ్ వెతుకుతున్నారా?
क्या आप ऑनलाइन क्लासेस के लिए किसी बेहतर प्लेटफॉर्म